On April 4, 2025, China issued what looked like a dry trade notice. 7 rare earth elements, plus the magnets that contain them, would now need export licenses. On paper, it sounded technical, bureaucratic, the kind of thing only customs lawyers and procurement teams would read closely. Then the shortage started to show up in the real economy. Car makers in the United States, Europe and Japan began rationing magnets. Some production lines slowed or stopped. Aerospace firms started worrying about yttrium, a rare earth used in coatings that help jet engine parts survive extreme heat. This was the strange part. The materials at the center of the panic were not even rare. So how did a group of fairly common metals become the thing that could make factories hesitate, defense planners sweat, and the world suddenly remember how much of modern industry depends on one country's processing chain? That is the rare earth story, not the rock. The bottleneck after the rock. Start with the name because the name is misleading. Rare earths are a set of 17 metals, 15 elements called the lanthanides, plus scandium and yttrium. And despite the name, they are not rare. Cerium, the most common of them, is the 25th most abundant element in the Earth's crust, more common than copper. There is no global shortage of rare earths sitting in the ground. So why rare? 2 reasons, and neither is about scarcity. First, they almost never occur in concentrated deposits. They're smeared thinly through rock, so finding a patch worth mining is hard. Second, and more important, they are chemically almost identical to one another, which makes separating them, pulling one rare earth cleanly away from the other 16, slow, messy, and technically brutal. That second problem is the whole story. The value was never in digging the rock out of the ground. It's in everything that happens after. Separating these near-twin elements, refining them into pure metals, and turning a handful of them into the most powerful, permanent magnets ever made. For most of the 20th century, rare earths were a quiet, minor industry, and the United States led it. A single mine in California, Mountain Pass, was the world's dominant source into the 1980s. Then the center of gravity moved. Through the 1990s and 2000s, China built out the entire chain, not just mining, but the dirty, low-margin, heavily polluting work of separation and refining that Western producers were happy to let go of. It was unglamorous, environmentally costly, and strategically decisive. While the rest of the world saw a commodity, China was quietly assembling a choke point. By the 2000s, the picture had inverted. Today, China mines somewhere around 2/3 of the world's rare earths, but it refines roughly 90% of them and makes around 93% of the world's rare earth magnets. The mine moved around. The processing did not. That gap between who digs and who refines, that was exactly where the leverage lies. Think of it as 4 steps. You mine the ore. You separate the 17 elements from one another. You refine them into pure metals, and then you turn a few of them into magnets. Most people picture the fight as being about step 1, the mine. It isn't. The pinch is in the middle, separation and magnet making. Here's why the magnets matter so much. Combine neodymium with iron and boron, and you get the strongest permanent magnets ever manufactured. Small, light, and ferociously powerful. They are what spins the motor in an electric car, what generates power inside a wind turbine, and what aims and steers inside missiles and jet engines. Modern technology runs on motors, and the best motors run on these magnets. But there's a catch, and it's where the heavy rare earths come in. A plain neodymium magnet loses its strength when it gets hot. Add small amounts of 2 heavy rare earths, dysprosium and terbium, and the magnet keeps working under extreme heat. That is the difference between a magnet good enough for a washing machine and one that survives inside a jet engine or a guided missile. And those 2 heavy elements are the scarcest, the hardest to separate, and the most concentrated in China of all. Demand for these magnets is climbing steeply, and almost everything driving it is strategic. The rare earth magnet market is worth roughly $20 billion today, and is heading toward 30 billion by 2030. Electric vehicles alone went from under 1% of magnet demand a decade ago to around 9% today, and that share is projected to roughly double again by 2030. Wind turbines, electronics, robotics, and defense pull in the same direction, and defense is where it gets sharp. By widely cited estimates, a single F-35 fighter holds on the order of 400 kilograms of rare earth materials, magnets, alloys, and coatings. A single Virginia-class submarine needs far more, on the order of 4,000 kilograms. Missiles, radar, jet engines, the most advanced weapons in the world depend on a supply chain that one country dominates. Then, in 2025, that dependency stopped being theoretical. On the 4th of April, China placed 7 rare earth elements and the magnets containing them under export licensing. Export volumes fell sharply, and within weeks manufacturers outside China were rationing magnets and, in some cases, idling production lines. Exports of yttrium to the United States, used to keep jet engine parts from melting, collapsed from over 300 tons to just 17. The International Energy Agency estimates China supplied roughly 90% of all the growth in rare earth supply between 2020 and 2024, and projects it will still control around 80% of the market in 2035. This is not a dependency that unwinds quickly. The conflict isn't really about whether the world needs rare earths. It obviously does. It's about who controls the processing and what happens when they decide to use that control. China's leverage is precise. The 2025 export licenses weren't a blunt ban. They were a dual-use system aimed especially at military end users among the US and its allies. A later round of rules went further still, claiming authority over any magnet made anywhere if it contained even a trace of Chinese-sourced rare earth. That is leverage that reaches across borders. For now, there's an uneasy truce. At the end of October 2025, a deal between Washington and Beijing suspended the harshest of the new controls for about a year. But the original April restrictions stayed in place, and the flows that resumed were uneven. European imports rebounded sharply, while US imports actually fell. The pause is a ceasefire, not a settlement, and it runs on a clock. So the real fight comes down to an asymmetry. China can tighten the valve with a few licensing decisions, almost overnight. The rest of the world can only loosen its dependence by building mines, refineries, and magnet plants, which takes the better part of a decade. One side moves in weeks, the other moves in years. The honest counter-argument is that this choke point is real, but temporary and possibly overstated. And there's genuine evidence for it. Start with the obvious. Rare earths aren't scarce, and the deposits aren't only in China. There are economic reserves in the United States, Australia, Brazil, Vietnam, and Canada. And the build-around is already underway. In the United States, the company MP Materials has struck a deal with the Department of Defense that makes the US government its largest shareholder, sets a floor price under its output, and commits to buying its magnets for the next decade, a deliberate attempt to stand up a supply chain that doesn't run through China. Australia's Lynas refines rare earths outside China in Malaysia and is trying to add heavy rare earth capacity in the United States too, though some of these projects are still fragile. Fresh capacity is due from 2026, and the US government is backstopping the effort with price floors and purchase guarantees. On the demand side, engineers are designing some motors to use fewer rare earths, or none at all, and recycling old magnets is becoming viable. It's a serious case, and parts of it are clearly right. The China can switch off the modern economy framing is too dramatic, but notice what the optimists concede. Diversifying the light, rare earths is the easy part. The heavy ones, the dysprosium and terbium that make a magnet survive a missile, are harder, dirtier, slower, and more technical to produce. By the IIK's own projection, countries outside China are on track to meet less than a fifth of demand for those heavy elements by 2035. The disagreement isn't about whether the choke point exists, it's about how long it lasts. The rare earth story is easy to flatten into a simple China story. China has the mines, China controls the metals, China holds the world hostage. That version is too clean. The real story is more uncomfortable because it shows how the world built its own dependency, piece by piece, and then acted surprised when the dependency became political. Rare earths are not scarce in the way oil can be scarce. The world has deposits. The United States has them. Australia has them. Brazil, Vietnam, Canada. They are not imaginary alternatives, but having the rock is not the same as having the industry. The power sits in the dirty middle: separation, refining, metal making, and magnets. The slow, chemical, expensive work that most countries were happy to outsource until it became strategic. And in 2025, China showed what that control looks like when it is not just sitting there quietly. It did not need to shut down the world. It only had to slow the flow, ask for licenses, and make companies outside China start counting magnets like emergency supplies. The optimistic view deserves to be taken seriously. This choke point can be weakened. New plants will open. Engineers will redesign motors. Governments will subsidize supply chains that would never survive on price alone. But that is the catch. This is not a question of whether the world can build around China. It probably can. The question is whether it can build fast enough. China's rare earth leverage is real, but not permanent. Every time Beijing uses it, it teaches everyone else to route around it. But the routing around takes years, sometimes a decade. The pressure arrives in weeks. 3 plausible versions of the next decade. And the real future is probably a blend. 1. The build-around wins. Diversification pays off. Linus, American magnet makers, and new refineries outside China come online. Government price floors keep them alive through the next price crash. Recycling matures. By the early 2030s, China's share has eroded from a stranglehold to merely a lead, and rare earths become an expensive, solved engineering problem rather than a weapon. 2. China keeps the edge that matters. The light rare earths diversify, but the heavy ones don't. Dysprosium, terbium, and the high-performance magnets stay concentrated in China because they're the hardest part of the chain to rebuild. Outside China, supply of those heavy elements stays below a fifth of demand, and Beijing keeps its grip exactly where it counts most: defense. The valve never fully opens. 3. The world designs the problem away. The pressure forces a different answer: motors that use fewer rare earths or none, better recycling, materials, science that routes around the bottleneck. Demand growth bends, and the weapon slowly loses its bite as the thing it controls becomes less essential. But this is the slowest path of all, measured in decades, not years. The most likely outcome isn't a clean win for any one of these. It's a race. The light rare earths diversify while the heavy ones stay China's edge into the early to mid-2030s. A decade-long contest between how fast the world can build around the choke point and how often Beijing chooses to use it. Go back to that April notice, a few lines of export control language, a list of elements most people had never heard of, a licensing rule for magnets, and then suddenly car factories were checking stockpiles, aerospace suppliers were watching yttrium, governments were reminded that the most advanced machines on Earth still depend on very physical things: metals, furnaces, solvents, magnets, and the companies that know how to make them. That is the part worth sitting with. Rare earths were never really about rarity. They were about confidence. The confidence that the processing would always be there, that the magnets would keep arriving, that the invisible middle of the supply chain did not need attention because it had worked yesterday. But choke points do not announce themselves when they are being built. They announce themselves when someone touches the valve. And rare earths show the same lesson again. Power does not always sit where the resource is buried. Sometimes it sits where the world has no easy way around.